following program is a presentation of the Waupaca Historical Society.
Testing. Can I? All right, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you so much to Tracy and Mike and the Waupaca Historical Society for inviting me back to speak and for their continued support of my research on the Channel Lakes. I don't know if everyone knows, but in 2020 I released a book on the Waupaca Channel Lakes, and that's kind of where my research has kind of continued from there. And so this presentation about boating is really, I decided to do it because boating was one aspect when writing my book that I was just very fascinated by. It has such an interesting history on the lakes, and I unfortunately didn't have as much time or space as I wanted to in my book to cover it. There's only about one chapter devoted to it exclusively. So I'm kind of expanding off of that for this presentation. So while working on this presentation, I couldn't help but recall my own experiences boating on the Channel Lakes as a child. So my family's been vacationing on the Channel Lakes since 1977, and I grew up my entire life every year going there for 2 weeks. And so we always stayed at the Pines Inn on McCrossin Lake, which was owned at the time by our friends Sandy and Elmer, who are here today. And so really, as a child, going on boat rides were always the highlights of our vacation. On the left is myself, and I'm in the center with my two cousins, Tyler and Jess, on a pontoon boat on Round Lake. And I absolutely loved getting to see the lakes by boat and take in the beautiful and unique scenery the lakes had to offer. And my cousins and I, of course, loved it when we got to Round Lake or Rainbow Lake and got to go fast, since those are the lakes where that's allowed. We also loved getting to explore McCrossin Lake on our own using a paddle boat that Sandy and Elmer owned and let us use. So that's on the right is myself with my cousin Jessica, and we're about 10 years old and we could barely reach the pedals. But we would always take multiple trips to the Slow No Wake buoy in the middle of McCrossin Lake every day. And it was just always such a great time. And in my reminiscing and my research, I began to realize that, for the most part, the reasons people love boating on the chain have not really changed that much since the late 19th century. People have boated on the lakes to see the chain's beauty up close and personal, spend time with family and friends, feel a sense of freedom exploring the open water, and overall have a fun time. But before we get over to kind of modern boating and the recreational from the late 1880s onward, or late 1800s onward, I want to just take a moment to talk about Native American boating on the Channel Lakes. So I must admit that I was originally going to title this presentation Boating on the Channel Lakes from Canoes to Chris Crafts, which would have covered canoes as well for the Native Americans. But I didn't end up using it just because I didn't think enough people would immediately recognize what a Chris Craft was. So I wanted to ask the audience, so when do you think Native Americans began boating on the Channel Lakes? Any guesses? 1840, okay. 2000 BC. Yep, very close. Yeah. 1500s. Yeah, all good answers. But yeah, so it's hard to tell for sure, but between 900 and 3,000 years ago, so a very long time. And we can't really say for sure because there's not a lot of documentation that any ancient canoes were ever found on the lakes that could be carbon dated or anything like that. But we do know Native Americans were on the lakes because in the 19th century, a lot of amateur archaeologists found burial mounds and effigy mounds, which are kind of mounds shaped like animals or other types of shapes that were relevant to the people who lived there. And so that culture that made the mounds was likely the woodland culture, which existed from 1000 BC to 12,000 or 1200 AD, so a very long time. And there's just not a lot of archaeological research that's been done on the lakes mounds because a lot of them were destroyed with construction and roads and things like that. But we can estimate that very recently, I don't know if anyone saw this in the news, but in Mendota Lake in Madison, Wisconsin, they actually uncovered in September 2020 a canoe that was about 3,000 years old. So that definitely shows that there could have Native Americans could have gotten up to the chain if they were in Madison area. And this is a picture of it right there of them uncovering it. So there are two main types of canoes that the Native Americans that lived on the lakes would have used. And by the time European Americans began exploring the lakes and settlers arrived in Waupaca County, it was the Menominee tribe that lived by the lakes. And there are probably other tribes that used the lakes as well, such as the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk. And the Menominee, from documentation, they used two types of canoes. So the first type was a dugout canoe, which was made by basically chopping down a tree and carving out kind of a log to make an interior that would float. And that was actually the type of canoe that was found in Mendota Lake. So that's kind of the older form. But the more modern form is birch bark canoes, which were made, they're much newer, and they were made by Native Americans would peel birch bark off of birch trees and then kind of shape them into canoes. So this picture here is actually on Long Lake in 1914, and it shows a young woman named Louise Ashman with a boat that her brother purchased from the Ojibwe in northern Wisconsin. So that was an example of the type of the canoes that would have been used. And this is kind of a picture of Menominee family in the 1890s building a birch bark canoe. They kind of had the sticks to use as like a frame, and then they would tie the birch bark together, all using kind of like natural fibers, such as like plants and things like that. Very similar to how they made wigwams for their house and baskets and all sorts of crafts and various tools that they used. And so just talking about the purpose of Native American boating, it was much different than today where it's very much recreational, it's for enjoyment. And really back then it was mostly to survive. So the Menominee, they would use the boats to fish. They would often spear fish or create kind of nets that they would catch fish in. Also, harvesting wild rice was a really big thing. So the wildlife that would grow kind of along the shore. We know for sure that there was wild rice, at least in Manaman Lake, in the upper chain or little chain, as it's called. And so wild rice was kind of, this photo here shows someone in the modern day showing kind of the traditional method for collecting it. They would have two sticks and kind of hold one stick against the stalks and like push the rice off essentially. And then also they used boating to travel to. It's hard to say if they would have used like perhaps the Crystal River to travel very far. It's more likely that they might have taken it as far as they could get to the Wisconsin River or another big river and then kind of put their boats back in. But definitely for getting around the lakes, they would use them. And one other interesting aspect is just that Native American spirituality really influenced how they kind of viewed boating. So one practice that the Menominee and other tribes did was when they would before setting out in a canoe, they would actually have tobacco, dry tobacco, that they would drop in the water as an offering. And they believed that their spirits in their kind of religion needed the tobacco in order to help them. So in many ways, it was kind of like saying a prayer before they got on the boat. And really boating back then was perhaps even more dangerous than it is now. Canoes could tip or capsize in deep water. You could get swept up in dangerous currents and rapids. We're not quite sure how the lakes looked back then, but it was likely water might have been higher. There might have been more currents that have been tamed with use over the years. And it also, the spirituality kind of influenced how they viewed the Chain of Lakes as well. So one example is they believed that a fish monster actually lived in McCrossin Lake. And this was because McCrossin, when entering it from the two channels to the east and the west, apparently back then the currents were very strong, and so it was very common for people to overturn in their canoes and then perhaps drown as well. So they believed that the fish monster called Matsinamek lived in McCrossin Lake, which in Menominee it translates to great fish or great sturgeon. So they believed the fish kind of overturned canoes and would pull swimmers or people that fell out of the boats down into the water and eat them. So it's kind of how they interpreted what was happening with people drowning and kind of just falling into danger on McCrossin Lake. And actually, because of this, they would also, while they were on their journey, they would strew tobacco before entering McCrossin Lake as well, just to add another prayer for protection. So jumping in to kind of the modern era, so the 30 years between 1850 and 1880 were not a big time for boating on the chain. This was mainly because settlers were arriving from the east, and when they came to the Waupaca area initially, starting in 1849, they didn't really see the lakes as a resource as much as they did the land around it, because they were very focused on farming for survival, really to just make it through the next year so they could build their lives there. So they didn't really focus on boating. There is a lot of evidence that they would fish though on the lakes to kind of supplement food as well, so we do know that. But so it wasn't really until the 1870s when the Wisconsin Central Railroad laid its tracks through Waupaca, and this allowed Waupaca people living and farming on the land could then sell their crops in national and international markets. So then they were able to get more money from that, and their quality of life started to improve. And with that, people started to have time for leisure, for recreation. And so they soon started viewing the Chain of Lakes as a recreation spot and began marketing it as a vacation destination. It's actually quite interesting, kind of in like 1879, from what the newspapers have kind of say, it's almost as if they're all of a sudden like, oh, the Chain of Lakes are here. We were going farther away to go on vacation when we could have been going right down a couple miles to the west for people in Waupaca. So in July 1879, Waupaca residents began building boathouses on Rainbow Lakes, mainly for people in Waupaca who wanted to come to the lakes. And then in 1880, a group of Waupaca businessmen created Greenwood Park on Rainbow Lake, which is today the site of the Veterans Home. And so first it was just a park that they made. They sold boats or leased out boats for like a day for people to use, and people picnicked and camped, and then they eventually built a hotel as well in 1881. And this etching is kind of a promotional image of the lakes that was made in 1881. And so it really shows Greenwood Park in kind of its glory. So you can really see kind of what boating would have looked like when people first started coming to the chain for recreation and tourism. You have a big steamer boat kind of out there that would give people tours of the lakes. Looks like a smaller steamer boat on the dock, which I'm not sure if it entirely actually was there or if like the artist took liberties. You can see sailboating was really big early on, and also canoeing. You can kind of see there's a canoe over there and over there as well. So before jumping into steamboats, which kind of dominated the late 19th century on the chain, I want to take a moment to discuss boats that weren't steam or gasoline powered. So canoes, rowboats, and sailboats. And they were really popular in the era because it was really the only way that individuals could explore the lakes at their own pace on their own. When they rode a steamboat, it was really a set route that the pilot would take them on. And so really, this basic principle hasn't changed. People still canoe and row and sail because they want to explore the lakes on their own. But what really has changed is the clothing that people wore. So really, before the 1940s, people wore quite formal clothing while canoeing or rowing or sailing. And it's really, so that would have been like corsets and long dresses for women. Men would wear suits or dress shirts and slacks. And I couldn't really imagine wearing these clothes while on a canoe. It would have been probably hot, and then if you tipped, the clothes would be heavy, so it'd be hard to swim. And actually this fact that perhaps because if you would be boating in these type of attire and you flipped over, the early promoters of the Chain of Lakes kind of had this in mind. And so some of their early promotional materials actually stress this. So this quote I found from an article that's kind of funny. It says, "One desirable feature of the Chain of Lakes is the general quiet of the waters. No sudden squalls ever come upon the boatman and unceremoniously capsize his boat. On this account, it is that boating by even women and children can be enjoyed without any prospect of disastrous results." And this was an article that was in the Madison Sunday Telegraph. So really they were kind of thinking about this. The Channel Lakes, they weren't as big as some of the other lakes in the area, like Lake Winnebago or Green Lake. So it was kind of much more friendly for really anyone to use canoes and to boat on the lakes. And this was actually kind of a significant concern because drownings were very common really in the past, kind of the late 19th century, early 20th century. And so actually in the first drowning of a recreational boating unfortunately occurred in July of 1881. There was a young woman named Anna Kate who was visiting from Stevens Point. She actually drowned in Pope Lake, unfortunately. So what happened was her and two other of her friends, a man and a woman, both went out on the boats by themselves, but none of them could swim, unfortunately, which they didn't really think about. And so they were on a canoe, and what happened was Anna Kate, she sat up, or I guess what happened was, so the board that she was sitting on, it kind of shifted, and so she sat up to try to fix it and then lost her balance. The canoe tipped over. Her two friends clung onto the boat, but unfortunately she didn't. And they were actually kind of stranded out there for a couple hours until they could be saved. So very unfortunate event. And swimming or drownings have occurred on the Channel Lakes quite a bit over the years, most of it by people who couldn't swim. And really this was because swimming just wasn't as common of skill back then, but really with the early 20th century, swimming, public pools became more prominent, people started to learn much earlier, and so the issue was alleviated a bit. And really it's unheard of today. But kind of getting to steamers now. So the first steamer came about because Waupaca residents really wanted a steamer so that people could see the lakes, so that they didn't have to use a canoe, really to promote tourism, to show off the lakes. And so this goal was accomplished when a man named Henry or Hank Mumbrew of Waupaca, who is a businessman, and he actually formerly operated steamboats on Lake Winnebago. So he actually built a steamboat named the Silas Wright. That was the first one on the Channel Lakes. And it was named Silas Wright because Mumbrew, he grew up in New York, and Silas Wright was a really popular politician when he was growing up. He was the governor of New York and a senator, I believe, too. And the boat, it was about 50 feet long, and it held 125 passengers, so really quite big for the day. And it had a paddle wheel powering it on the back, it was powered by a steam engine. And it was launched on July 1st, 1881, so very early on. And it really just helped the Channel Lakes kind of explode as a tourism destination. People could come. They could see the lakes. The boat gave a tour of the lakes north of Indian Crossing, very similar to the route the Chief takes today. Trips were only about 10 cents, which is around the equivalent of about $3 today, maybe more closer to $5. So it was a pretty economical way to view the lakes. And this photo here is actually a close-up of the etching. I'm pretty sure that this boat is the Silas Wright, just based off if it was the only steamboat on the Channel Lakes in the 1880s, so that's very much likely what it looked like. And so steamboats were very, very interesting technology. So I will preface just by just saying that I'm not an expert in marine engines from the 19th century. I kind of have a basic understanding that I wanted to share just to give you an idea of how operating it would have looked like. So really the boiler was where you started to get the boat going. So you would basically put wood or coal in the boiler and it would burn, and then there was water in the engine that then heated up. This created steam. The steam, the exhaust would go out the smokestack on top. So you see a lot of steamers have the smokestack in a lot of the pictures. This would then, so the water would heat up, it'd create steam that would go into the cylinder. This would cause the pistons to kind of rise and start to move and turn, which turned the drive shaft and then the propeller. And so it moved forward that way. And then there's also a rudder on the back that was connected to usually a steering wheel on the front that had like wires that went to the rudder to control it. There would have been, this picture shows kind of how the equipment would have been laid out on a steamboat at the chain around the turn of the century. So you had the The engine would have been in kind of the middle of the boat, and then the boiler as well. So those would be in the middle. The steering wheel was at the front. And steamboats, they required, because someone had to be in the back feeding the burner, and then someone had to steer. So you always usually needed 2 people to operate them. And just riding on a steamer was an incredibly different experience or way to view the lakes than what we're used to as speedboats. Steamers moved at the incredible speed of 5 miles per hour. So it was a very slow going trip. So you would have had a lot of time to enjoy and appreciate the scenery. I really like this photo of people on a chain steamer in 1899 because it kind of highlights another aspect of the steamboats, which would have been socializing. So you'd have had a lot of time if you went with a group of friends to talk and chat and catch up while enjoying the scenery, maybe make new friends as well. And so if anyone's gone on the Chief Waupaca today, you can kind of get a taste of what riding steamers would have been like. But I'm pretty sure the Chief Waupaca moves a bit faster than 5 miles per hour. So the Silas Wright appears to have really been the only steamboat in the 1880s. This was probably because they're just very expensive to buy and operate as well. So it wasn't until around 1893 when Jim Jensen of Waupaca built 2 new steamboats for the lakes. So the first one was called the Queen, and it was a very long and slim but very small steamboat that could be operated by just 1 person. And then there was the Sunrise, which was longer and wider, that required 2 people to operate. And most people would probably know it as the Lady of the Lake, because that was its name it was given later on. So they were originally owned by Major R.N. Roberts of Waupaca, who was, I believe, he was a banker. No, that's another one. Yeah, I believe he was a businessman in Waupaca. But he actually hired a Wisconsin Veterans Home resident to operate both of the steamboats and give out tours. And then they were purchased by William Smith, who was a farmer who ran a boarding house on Round Lake and would later own the Loxley Lodge. So he purchased them and he renamed the Sunrise the Lady of the Lake. Smith was really big into literature, and the Lady of the Lake is kind of a character, I believe, in Arthurian legend, so that's kind of where the name came from. But so this photo shows the Sunrise, or the Lady of the Lake, around 1901. So William Smith sold it in 1901 to Captain Charles Merriam, who lived on Nestling Lake, and he actually operated the boat with his stepdaughter, Bessie. And she really started piloting the boat at age 12. So she would be in the front piloting while Captain Merriam was in the back feeding the boiler. And Bessie would do this for really most of her teen years until they ended up having to get rid of the boat. But what's interesting about both the Queen and the Lady of the Lakes is that they're actually still at the chain of lakes. They're just underwater. So both of them were shipwrecked. And so kind of when you first think of it, what comes to mind is you think that, oh, did they sink with people on it? Was it kind of similar to like the Titanic on a smaller scale? Unfortunately, it was not as dramatic as that. So what happened was both the Queen and the Lady of the Lakes got very old and outdated, and they just became unusable. And so how they got rid of boats back then, the easiest way was to light them on fire and sink them in the water. This was really just because it would have been rather expensive to send the parts somewhere else to be reused and disposed of. And this was actually, it was also common kind of early on, especially in rural areas, to dispose of cars that were out beyond use into swamps and sometimes lakes too. So it was just kind of their way they thought about getting rid of things. So the Queen was sunk in Round Lake in the 1910s, and it was actually sunk at the spot, a sandbar, kind of, I pointed out here, that many people know today as the Sunken Island on Round Lake. And so they had it sunk in about the 1910s, and they lit the ship on fire. It sunk very easily, and the Smiths left. So the flags at the front and back of the boat were both still sticking out of the water. So it kind of also served as like a warning for people to not run into the sandbar. So that was kind of their reasons. And actually, it's really cool. There's this video on YouTube that shows kind of it's a video underwater of the remains of the Queen today. So it's very much kind of the bottom of the boat is what's left. A lot of the rest of it has rotted. So I definitely recommend looking it up on YouTube. The person does identify it as the Lady of the Lake, but it was likely the Queen because of where it was sunk. So the Lady of the Lake became unusable in about 1914. And so Captain Merriam, so he wanted to get rid of it. So they brought the boat to the middle of Nestling Lake and lit it on fire. But unfortunately, it didn't stay in place and sink the way they wanted it to. The wind caught it and actually went kind of towards the eastern shore and landed in shallow water. And so half of the boat was sticking up for about 20 or so years. And it's actually really interesting. It was only in about 10 feet of swampy water, and people would actually swim out to the ship and lay on it to sunbathe or to go out there and hang out with friends, to drink perhaps, really up until it started to rot. And I believe by the 1930s, it was probably completely underwater. And what's actually cool is, so the Nelson family who Bessie Merriam married Edward Nelson, and the Nelson family own Nelson Cottages today. So in the 1960s, one of Bessie's grandsons actually swam out and saved the propeller and drive shaft of the Lady of the Lake. And you could still see it today. It's in front of Nelson's Cottages, in front of their main office. I actually went there a couple of weeks ago. So it's kind of cool to see this piece of history. But so steamboats started to kind of become out of fashion starting in 1900. So what happened was gasoline-powered boats started to be developed, and they began to supersede speedboats as the main power boats on the chain of lakes. Both photos were used at the same time, though, as this photo of Camp Cleghorn from about sometime in the first decade of the 20th century, circa 1905. So they both operated at the same time for many years, but steamboats would eventually start to deteriorate and people stopped buying them in about the 1910s. Just because the gasoline launches were so much easier and more desirable to own and operate. So the first gasoline-powered motorboat was invented in San Francisco in 1884, but they weren't widely produced in the Great Lakes until the late 1890s. And so in 1900, W.B. Baker of Waupaca, he was a baker, he brought the first gasoline-powered boat to the chain of lakes, or he at least claimed that he did. And this photograph here shows the vessel. Early gas launches tended to be very long and narrow and kind of small, but they would eventually get bigger. But by the early 1900s, it was very easy to purchase a gasoline launch. An article in the Appleton Crescent from 1903 says that a small gasoline launch can be secured for a little over $100, which would have been probably about a couple thousand in today's currency. So it's pretty easy to purchase these, much cheaper than steamboats. And then in 1907, the Waupaca Powerboat Club formed, both to promote boat ownership on the lakes and also to organize social events around boating, just to get people really into using them. So these photos of a small gasoline launch on Round Lake are really interesting because you can very clearly see what the motor would have looked like. So the engine was in the middle of the boat, and the photo on the left shows, like with most steamboats, the engine would have been connected to a drive shaft under the boat and then a propeller on the back. So that's kind of how they moved. And then you would steer it using a steering wheel on the front. This picture on the right, it's a little deceiving, but the man is actually in the front of the boat there. And that's actually Edward Nelson, who married Bessie Nelson. So this was probably a boat owned by Nelson's Boat Line. So gasoline launch worked a little differently, but kind of similar. It was just a different power source than steamboats. So you had a gas bag that would, or tank later on, that would feed gas into the engine. And it would, so basically how it worked was, You had a gas bag, the gas entered the cylinder, and then inside this chamber, the gas would be ignited by a spark created by an exploder, which it's really hard to see in this diagram, but basically how it worked was there was two pieces of metal and like one piece would strike really hard against it, and that would create a spark. Much later on, it would be replaced by spark plugs, actually quite, I believe the 1910s or 1920s, early forms would be developed. And then the exploder would create force that would then pull the pistons up and then they would be left down. So kind of similar with the pistons and moving the drive shaft, but the main source of power was different. And yeah, this diagram is just a single cylinder engine. Some of the passenger launches had anywhere from 1 to 3 different cylinders that would kind of be all right up next to each other, depending on how big the boat was and how much speed you needed to move it. So early on, the shift from steamers to gas launches did not really change the experience of seeing the lakes too much. So early gasoline launches moved at about 10 miles per hour, so only about 5 miles per hour more than steamers. So you still saw the lakes at a relatively slow pace. But what did change was that it was a lot easier to purchase gasoline launches than it was to purchase steamers. Just because they were cheaper to make and buy, they were a lot easier to operate. You really needed to just turn them on or get them going, and then it would be move along, unlike the steamer where you had to constantly put wood or coal into it. And one person could operate it, so you didn't need the 2 people. And since it was easier to own and buy one, people had a lot more freedom. So when you rode a steamer, as I mentioned, you were on a very set route, and you went where the pilot went and usually had to commit to a multi-hour trip. But with your own steam launch, you could kind of go out as you please. This photo shows Roy Shady, who I believe lived in Waupaca as well, as a small launch that he owned. You can kind of see the engine there that he's holding on to, and then the steering wheel on front. And it was kind of like you almost had the freedom of a canoe to kind of move about the lakes at your own pace. And so I actually included this photo because it's the cover of my book, but I realized that while researching for this presentation that I actually misidentified the boat. I call it a canoe in my book, which I didn't quite look at it that closely at the time. My first clue should have been they don't have any oars. I don't know why I didn't think about that. But also you can kind of see close on, he has kind of the steering wheel that's the same as the other gas launches. And you can almost, I believe, see kind of a propeller in the back as well, or a little bit. So just realized that in my research for this presentation. One interesting part of gasoline launches is that they had to be closely maintained because if any part of the engine that contained gasoline malfunctioned, the boat could catch on fire very easily. So this happened in August 1908 when a gasoline launch called the Lake Breeze burned on Columbia Lake. It had just picked up a crowd of passengers at Camp Cleghorn. So what actually happened was the pipe that ran from the gasoline tank to the engine broke and gasoline started pooling in the bottom of the boat and then eventually caught on fire. Luckily the boat, it was kind of just coming up to Indian Crossing, so they were able to get into shallow water very easily and people were able to jump out. No one luckily passed away because of it. Some people just had burns and they were brought over to the hospital at the veterans home. And there's actually quite a couple of other incidents I encountered of gasoline launches burning. There was one in Nelson's Dock that burned in like around 1940. And it's really interesting because there aren't many accounts of steamboats blowing up, which sometimes happened with the boiler. That could just be there wasn't enough on the chain for that probability to happen. Also, by the time people brought steamers to the lakes, the technology had kind of been perfected, whereas gasoline launches were kind of still experimental. So the transition from steam to gas-powered boats also led to the development of boat line and livery businesses on the chain. So in the late 1800s, because most people, if they wanted to give tours of the lake, they would purchase and operate one steamboat. That was really all they could afford. And so they didn't really expand their business. Whereas with gasoline launches, they are cheap and easy to operate, so it was very easy to expand your fleet and offer a couple different boats to give tours. So these are some of the three earliest boat lines that operated on the chain. Many of the founders of these businesses originally just owned boats and picked up passengers at the electric dock, which was located kind of by the Grandview Hotel on Rainbow Lake, close to the Veterans Home. And it was named the electric dock because that's where people who got off of the electric trolley would come down, and then they would catch boats to the cottage that they were staying at, or if tourists came to visit for the day, that's where they would catch a tour boat. And so, as I mentioned before, Captain Charles Merriam bought the Lady of the Lake steamer in 1901, and this was really just as gasoline boats were arriving. So actually, because he cooperated the business with his stepdaughter Bessie, she actually encouraged him to start purchasing gasoline launches as well to really expand their business. She was younger, and so she might have been more kind of in touch with kind of the current developments for boats in the period. And actually, by the time Charles passed away in 1915, the company was giving tours on the Lady as well as three other gasoline launches, the Mayflower, the Princess, and the Alice R. So they were able to grow their business quite a bit. So similar to Charles and Bessie Merriam, Hobart or Hobie Edmonds and his father John, they operated a boat line that originally just included one steamboat called the Glide that John mostly operated. And at the age of 16, Hobie bought his own 15-passenger gallon launch called the Anna that he added to the fleet. And so it's really interesting that you have two families where multiple generations are. One's a steamboat operator, the next generation starts operating gasoline launches. It's kind of interesting. Hobie and Bessie were about, I believe Bessie was about 10 years older or so, but it's still kind of interesting that they both got into boating so young in their family business. So in 1915, Hobie commissioned the construction of the Mandalay, which could fit up to 40 people. His first boat could fit about 16, so he was growing his business. This boat shows the Mandalay picking up campers at Camp Onaway. And so I'm pretty sure that's more than 40 people in the boat. So you could almost see it kind of sinking a little bit maybe. But definitely wouldn't see this today, most likely, with boating laws. Yeah. So in the 1920s, both Hobart Edmonds and Bessie Merriam, they started to build physical docks to operate their boat lines out of. And so they also expanded their boats to be more boat liveries. Boat liveries essentially is just a word for a business or dock that rents out boats for people to use. And so the reason why it took until the 1920s for this to start to happen was originally most of the hotels and boarding houses or other small lodges, they usually had their own boats that they would rent out to their guests. But in the 1920s, the hotels started to decline because more people were coming to the lakes on automobile, and so they wanted to stay in their own cottage. They didn't want to stay in a hotel. So really they needed a new place to find the boat liveries. And so that's where Nelson's boat line came about. So Bessie Merriam, she met a man named Edward Nelson in 1919. They got married and rebranded the business as Nelson's Boat Line and Livery. And they purchased a location on Rainbow Lake, kind of like right when you enter it from Nestling Lake on to the east. And they're actually, I believe the boathouse here was still on the lakes until a couple years ago when it was knocked down. And so really they offered, in addition to their boat lines, they also rented out canoes and rowboats, and also like perhaps had fishing guides, picnic grounds, bait shops. They really grew them into kind of big businesses.
I had one of their canoes. It's a 1921 Old Town.
Nice.
I realized it was theirs when I sent him the serial number to Old Town.
Oh, very cool. Nice. And then Hobart Edmond built his dock on Taylor Lake on the site that's now the Clearwater Harbor. And I believe this boathouse is on the left of the photo there are still part of the harbor today. I believe also the boathouse too, or the dock house on the right there. And what's kind of interesting is that, so both on the Nelson, you see there's one sign on the right that says Nelson's Boat Livery, that's where you went to get your boats. And then you can't see it in this picture, but on the other dock it says Nelson's Boat Line. So two different docks for two different purposes. Same thing with Edmunds here, you have the boat line, Edmunds dock and boat line on the right, and Edmunds Livery on the left. So kind of both parts of their business in different spots. So boat liveries also started to turn canoeing down the Crystal River into an experience that tourists could purchase. People have been canoeing down the Crystal River independently since the 1880s. The first article about the Chain of Lakes as a tourist destination mentions that you could take the Crystal River to Waupaca if you wanted. But really most people would either do it by themselves or they would have a guide. But really with the boat liveries that came along, they created a whole package where they would take you on a gasoline launch through the lakes, which kind of was an experience in itself, dropped you off by Long Lake where the Crystal River starts. Then you would ride the river throughout the day, and then they'd pick you up at the end of the day. So really kind of making it very easy for people to go down the lakes, especially if they weren't new, or if they were new to canoeing or they didn't own their own canoes. And this picture of is from the 1920s, shows probably the Mandalay or one of Nelson's launches bring canoes. I think this is in Round Lake, but it became a very common sight to see this. And really, Ding's dock was still using the similar launches until maybe about 10, 15 years ago. And yeah, they started to offer Crystal River canoe trips for the next century. And it wasn't until just last month that Ding's dock actually said they're stopping doing Crystal River trips, unfortunately. So kind of the end of an era there, but almost 100 full years of the trip being offered like that. So moving into the speedboat era, which goes from the 1930s until today that we're still arguably in. So boat designers, mixed up my notes here, sorry. So one of the most interesting aspects of boating history in the 20th century is just how quickly gasoline-powered boats evolved. With each passing decade, they became faster and more aerodynamic. But before we jump into the arrival of steamboats, or of, speedboats, in the 1920s and 30s, we have to take a look at some of the advancements boat builders were making during the era of gasoline launches. So outboard motors, or motors that sat outside the boat, are the most common form of boat motors used today. They were actually invented in the first decade of the 20th century. In 1905, a man named Cameron Waters around Detroit created the first outboard engine, and he actually adapted a motorcycle engine to really create the first prototype, and that's where he got his inspiration from. And he began producing them the following year, but unfortunately his model just wasn't very commercially successful or practical. It wasn't until 1907 when Ole Evinrude developed the first mass-produced and commercially successful outboard motor. And Evinrude Motors, I believe, is still operating today. No? Oh, right. So, yeah, but they were operating until, I believe, like the 90s, right? 2 years? Oh, very recent. Yeah, and so outboard motors were really mainly used for small crafts until the late 1940s. This was just because the engines weren't quite powerful enough to do larger boats. And actually it's interesting because they were kind of considered kind of the poor man's boat almost, because people couldn't purchase bigger steamboats, but they were able to purchase the Evinrude motor or a similar model that could be attached to any rowboat. So it was a very economical way to get into boating. And another major advancement was actually the shape of boats. So kind of early gasoline launches, they were usually had this hull shape that's called the fantail design. So the fantail stern, so that stern's the back of the boat. And so this basically means the stern was very thin in the bottom and then kind of got bigger as it went up. And this model was kind of counterintuitive for speed because the propeller with this model pushed the entire boat through the water. So you were kind of fighting the water pressure against the hull. And so it was harder to go faster. So boat designers started to kind of experiment with hull shapes in the early 20th century because they wanted to make gasoline boats faster. And one of their main motivations was actually boat racing. So a lot of boat builders, they created boats to compete in races. And so they experimented with all sorts of design. It became a very popular sport. And actually in 1916, there was a widely publicized boat race on Rainbow Lake that crowds from all over kind of Stevens Point and Appleton and really the kind of east central Wisconsin came out to see. And it was actually the crowd gathered on the Grandview Hotel and watched from the dock on Rainbow Lake. And through this experimentation, boat builders began to realize that boats would achieve more speed if they're actually pushed out of the water by the propeller. And so this process, it's called hydroplaning. And you could see in this image that some of the boat designers or the boats in this race kind of were starting to apply those principles to really push the boat out of the water to go faster, especially the one in the lead in this photo. And this would lead to the development of runabouts. So in the 1920s, boat builders began to apply the principle of hydroplaning to their commercially produced boats, and thus began manufacturing runabouts. So runabouts were small 2 to 10 passenger boats that skimmed above the water. They had what are called planing or kind of V-shaped holes that kind of pushed them out of the water. They were usually made of wood. Chris Craft Boats of Algonac, Michigan, and other companies began producing runabouts on a large scale for the middle class in the late 1920s. And Chris Craft was actually the first boat company to standardize their boats, and they implemented an assembly line, so very similar to like Henry Ford was doing with automobiles. And before this time, speedboats were usually really only owned by the wealthy because they were the ones who could afford it. But with kind of these newer runabouts, they were just much cheaper to make, and so kind of it opened up a whole new range of people to be able to purchase boats. Runabouts had inboard engines, meaning the engine was in the boats. They were usually covered and had an ignition switch in the cockpit, as you can kind of see there. So it's hard to say who exactly had the first runabout on the chain. It's likely that at least a few people purchased runabouts in the late 1920s when they first started to be commercially produced. But in the 1930s, boat liveries started adding runabouts to their fleets. Edmunds Dock claims to have had the first runabout, which was a Chris Craft. And so it's actually really interesting. Edmunds started offering thrill rides. So people who were taking a Chris Craft boat, perhaps being ferried somewhere or going out on a tour with a driver, they could pay an extra $1 and the driver would kind of give them a very fast ride along the lakes, do a lot of zigzags and turns. And for people who were used to kind of slow moving gasoline launches, that must have been quite a thrill, especially. There you go, yeah, so very exciting for them.
I used to drive the boats.
Nice. How much did you pay for thrill rides back then?
Yeah, a 1-hour narrated launch tour was $1.
Oh, nice.
The North Star, 41 feet, or the Starlight, 38 feet, or the Viking, which was 28 feet. And the Chris Craft ride, I think, also was $1.
Oh, nice.
Gas was very high at the lake, 39 cents.
Oh, wow.
Mixed with oil, 49 cents. Downtown, 28 cents.
Yeah, so Nelson's Boat Line also purchased a runabout in the 30s, and at the age of 15, Betty Nelson, who is Bessie's daughter, also as a teenager, she started piloting the line's Chris Craft, so very much taking after her mother, who was piloting the Lady of the Lake 30 years earlier. So boat builders also started to revamp gasoline launches with holes that also kind of planed on the surface of the water, like the runabouts. This is a photo of the Viking at Edmonds boat line. And so you can kind of see it's very much pushed out of the water compared to the earlier steam launches that sat very low on the water. And the newer gas launches like the Viking actually averaged around 20 to 25 miles per hour, so they went a little bit faster. Runabouts actually kind of could reach speeds of up to 30 mile per hour originally, and then they would get faster as the time went on. So really seeing this lakes on speedboats was a drastically different experience than really before. They were much faster, and so really kind of taking a ride on the boat became more about the thrill of going fast than just a leisurely ride around the lakes, though of course they would take breaks and do the more leisurely route as well. And speedboats also allowed for the development of skiing and other water sports. Skiing actually became popular in the 1940s after Dick Pope Sr. Promoted it at his Cypress Gardens theme park in Florida. Many Chaita Lakes tourists actually saw the skis that Dick Pope's skiers were using and created their own, so there was a lot of experimentation. Also on the right here is so basically a tourist on the Chaita Lakes, he found a model for what's called an aquaboard on kind of a magazine catalog, and so he then built it himself. It was about I believe 2 feet by 4 feet, and you kind of rode it with kind of our handlebar like you can see there. It's definitely very creative.
It was a rope.
Oh, it was a rope. Oh yeah, there's no, I'm thinking of my modern day.
Surfboard, if you will.
Originally most,
For a long time before it rotted away.
yeah. So originally most people water skied using small boats powered by outboard engines, as shown on the photo of the left, but of course they would have used runabouts too as they got more powerful. Speedboats actually created a lot of safety problems for the Chaita Lakes that boaters had not had to deal with before, mainly people who like to go fast. So in 1941, the Waupaca the Chaita Lakes Motorboat Club petitioned the Wisconsin state legislature to establish a speed limit for boats on the Chaita Lakes. They settled on 15 miles per hour on open water, and and they also didn't that speed was in open water, and then they had about much smaller. They didn't want people to go too fast in channels or within 100 feet of the shore. So the measure was passed in 1941, but it wasn't very effective. And this was because the enforcement of the speed limit was left to the Waupaca County Sheriff's Office, which did not have any boats at the time. So they couldn't really enforce people at a squad car on the shore, so it was very hard to kind of prove that people were speeding. Some local people wanted the towns of Dayton and Farmington to pay for a boat and the sheriff to then hire someone to enforce the speed limit, but the towns originally deemed it too expensive. But then they started to have some issues. So there was a man named Francis Skipper Carey who was a frequent speeder. He drove the Chris Craft for Edmonds boat line. And so he really got a reputation for speeding a lot. In 1947, there was like a kind of a Chaita Lakes meeting where people got together and they very much accused him of a lot of unsafe activity. So he was accused of driving so fast past a boat piloted by an elderly couple that the boat flipped and the elderly couple almost drowned. So very kind of creating some big safety issues. And this shows Carey riding his Roaring 40 hydroplane, a small boat made for racing. And it was named as such because it reached speeds of 40 miles per hour, so this is even perhaps evidence that he was violating the speed limit. But eventually in 1949, in part because of Skipper Carey, the Waupaca County Sheriff's Office formed a water patrol in cooperation with Farmington and Dayton as well. And so they actually hired so they started to be able to enforce the speed limit on the lakes. And then in 1960, they actually removed the steam limit for the larger lakes that are still the fast lakes today, Columbia, Long, Round, and Rainbow. And that's kind of the modern iteration. And then they established a 6 miles per hour speed limit on all the other lakes. And also the speed limit would apply to 100 feet from the shore and in channels as well. So they kind of finally figured out the best way to do it, because 15 miles per hour, especially as boats were getting faster, would have been rather slow still if people wanted to go fast. Arthur Kruger was the first Chain of Lakes patrolman. So he started as the first patrolman. Not a popular guy, I'm guessing.
Creepy.
Yeah. Yeah. So he served for about 21 years and was very well known along the lakes, perhaps infamous. And actually 2 weeks after Kruger started, he arrested Skipper Carey for violating the speed limit, and then he arrested Carey a month later. Unfortunately, they couldn't prove in court that he had actually been speeding, so he got off. But Skipper Carey kind of got the message, and he started to focus more of his attention on racing miniature kind of go-karts. So he kind of redirected his need for speed on land, perhaps in a safer way. It's a very interesting character. I actually wrote a whole blog post about him on my website just because of his interesting elements.
One of the interesting points, see the light bring buoy in the back of that?
Yeah.
It hangs at the outside bar of the harbor right now.
Oh, very cool. Still see it today. And I believe this picture is at the Farmington Town Hall today still. That's the people who gave it to me. So getting into the post-World War II era, so this is, once World War II ended, boat builders introduced new upgrades that made speedboats look and function very much like the ones that we use today. So one of the big advancements was actually using fiberglass instead of wood to construct boats. So fiberglass speedboats began being produced in the late 1940s and soon became more popular than wooden boats for several reasons. First, fiberglass was much cheaper to purchase than wood. It was also stronger, lighter, and required less maintenance. Wood boats could rot over time if you didn't keep up with them properly. And in addition, boat builders could also shape fiberglass into any shape imaginable. So they were not limited by the way the wood would have leaned or how they had to bend it. And then this photo shows several fiberglass boats on Edmund stock in the 1960s, and it's kind of cut off with the gasoline pumps around the left there.
1964 that was taken.
Oh, no.
I worked there that day.
Oh, very cool. Are you in the photo?
No.
Oh,
Those are the Nelson boys in there, though.
oh very cool.
Hobie Edmonds, not Hobie Edmonds. What's his name?
Todd Nelson?
Todd Nelson.
Oh, okay.
There's kids.
I think that's Dave.
Pretty cool.
Yes.
And then also in the 1950s, outboard engines began to be used on larger boats. By that time, boat companies were creating outboard engines that had as much power as inboard motors, and outboards began to be used for larger boats as well as inboard. They also started to develop the inboard outboard or stern drive, so ones that were half in, half out. And outboard motors just had a lot of advantages over inboards that kind of started to make them more popular, including just that they provide better top speeds. They're easier to service because you don't have to go in the boat to access them, and you could take them off to service them. And then also they're lighter and allow for more room on the boat. So all of these things, I believe by the 60s that the outboard engine started to be sold more than inboard. And then also, boat ownership increased drastically in the 50s and 60s, in part because fiberglass was cheaper, but mainly because the economic boom of the 1950s just gave individuals more money to spend on recreation. And so this led to an increased demand for power boats, and the competition it created between boat companies has led to decades of innovation in the design and construction of speedboats and the engines. So really created this competitive market that led to more innovation. Yes. Oh, very cool. And so as it became more common for individuals to owned their own boats, boat lines and liveries had to adapt. So seeing the lakes in a crowded gasoline launch started to become less desirable. So liveries adapted by adding new services. They sold gasoline dockside. They rented out speedboats instead of just giving rides in them. And they also started selling and servicing boats. Prell's boat livery did a very good job of adapting to the time. So this livery began in 1949 when Norman and Betty Prell took over Camp Cleghorn's in-house boat livery. And they started to make it into a much more outward facing. So it wasn't just for the people who owned cottages there, but for anyone on the lakes. And so they actually became a service center for Evinrude Motors, which was kind of their one of the big parts of their services. And so they could both sell Evinrude Motors and also service them on the lakes. And Prell's eventually they added another location on Limekiln Lake, and that today is now the only location, and it's now Becker's Marina. So Prell's is still active today as Becker's Marina. So Ding's Dock also, Ding's Dock is another interesting story. They were founded in 1945, so just as personal steamboats were starting to become more popular. So one of the ways, they of course added the same services as Prell's, but they also stayed relevant by kind of revamping the Crystal River trip. So they were one of the first liveries to use fiberglass canoes for the Crystal River trip. They're actually developed by Laverne Nelson, who owned Edmonds Dock at the time. And so both Edmonds and Ding's Dock were kind of using these canoes for the canoe trip. And unfortunately, it seems that Prell's livery as Becker Marina and Ding's Dock are really the only boat liveries from kind of pre-1960s that have survived to the present day. A lot of them, perhaps because of kind of that boating was more popular. It was more common to have a personal boat instead of needing to rent them or take rides on them. So like Nelson's would kind of disappear or went out of business after the 50s. Edmonds closed down, I believe, in the late 60s, early 70s, and then is now the Clearwater Harbor today.
Oh, naturally, it's Adventure Outfitters boat rental also.
Yeah, yeah.
So we do still have a livery.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where Becker Marine is located now, that was Ding's Dock.
Yes. Yeah, and they moved to where they are today, I believe, in the 70s. Oh, nice. So I wanted to end tonight's presentation by telling the story of the Chief Waupaca and the Lady of the Lakes at Clearwater Harbor, because it really brings the history of boating on the chain full circle. So the Chief was originally known as the Chief Oshkosh. It was built in 1963 by the Chief Oshkosh Brewing Company to deliver beer on Lake Winnebago and the surrounding waterways, not out of necessity, but more as a promotional kind of service so that they can kind of promote their business. And they actually modeled the boat after an earlier steamboat that operated in Oshkosh in like around the 1910s called the Paul L, and that cruised the same waters. So the Chief Oshkosh went through many owners, and then it eventually broke down in 1970 and was docked on Lake Butte des Morts and kind of left there. And 3 years later, in 73, Joe Leanne, who was the owner of Ding's Dock at the time, bought the Chief Oshkosh with his employee, Pat Megan. And this is how the boat looked when Megan and Leanne bought it, so very run down. So to get the Chief Oshkosh to Waupaca, Leanne and Megan, they actually had to get it in the winter, and so they had to saw it out of the ice using a chainsaw. So this is a picture of that from the late Joe Leanne and Ginny Leanne's collection. And then they transported it, they took it apart and transported it over to the lakes on trucks, flatbed trucks like this. And so they had to move it in pieces. So that must have been really kind of scary to move. I would have been horrified to do that. But it made it here. And then they rebuilt it at Ding's Dock. And then it started, they rebuilt it at Ding's Dock, and then in the summer of 1974, it graced the chain's waters for the first time. And it initially docked at Ding's Dock when it was still located where Becker's Marina is today, so it was still able to traverse the upper lakes like that. But then Megan and Leanne realized they needed a harbor for the boat, so they purchased the old Edmonds Dock facility on Taylor Lake and started the Clearwater Harbor. And I believe Joe Leanne left the business because the Megans wanted to turn it into a restaurant as well, and so he parted ways then.
That man is here tonight.
Oh.
Should we point him out?
Oh.
And a correct pronunciation, Meehan?
Meehan? Okay.
Calling him Meehan and not something else, right?
Yeah, so unlike steamboats of the late 19th century, the Chief's Waupaca's paddle wheel is propelled by a diesel engine, which you can actually see in a photo here of it being replaced in 1986. So much faster than the tradition and much easier to operate than the traditional steam engine. And to complete the fleet, the harbor commissioned the construction of a motor yacht that could fit under the Indian Crossing Bridge in 1983. And as an homage to the Lady of the Lake, piloted by Bessie Merriam Nelson at the turn of the century, they named the boat the Lady of the Lakes. And then the popularity of both the Chief and the Lady over the past 50 years have really shown that while the arrival of steamboats have propelled the chain into a new era, many tourists and local still long to see the lakes as at the slow and relaxed pace of the steamers and speedboats of the previous era. So it's kind of very much coming full circle. And that's all I have for you today.